So what I thought about talking about today, if this would be interesting to you, is how the Orthodox Church in America has gotten so confused with all these different jurisdictions and all of these, how did that happen? And who are the various groups and such? Is that interesting?
Yes.
Okay. So I talked the last class. I don't think you were here. Was the talked about the 19th century, and that was the foundation of. And just to recap very briefly, 1794, the missionaries came to Alaska and established a mission and started establishing the church throughout Alaska.
This is the Russian.
The Russians came to Alaska. In 18 about by the 1820s, most of the Russian missionaries had gone, except for one, Saint Herman, who lived on Spruce Island near Kodiak until 1837 when he died, and he was the only one of the original missionaries who stayed that long.
Why did he decide to stick around and the other ones left?
Well, because he was able to pursue his monastic vocation here as living as a hesychast, living in the forest and also caring for the native people.
You explain what a hesychast is.
Somebody whose life is focused on the Jesus prayer.
Would that be every Orthodox person?
No, it's a very specific monastic practice.
Okay.
It's living as a hermit, essentially. And there's a very specific lifestyle of a hermit living in a deserted place. And it's basically focused on the practice of the Jesus prayer and silence more than on the services. I think he probably did do some services, but he wasn't a priest. He was a lay monk.
Okay.
And he became the first saint, the first saint of America. He became an elder. He matured to a profound degree spiritually, and and not only through works of mercy with the native peoples. He cared especially for the orphans and for the sick. Of course, there were massive epidemics that swept through the native community at that time because of the Europeans coming and bringing diseases that the Native Americans had no immunity to, and it left many orphans. But there were also stories of his stopping a tidal wave, for example. There was an earthquake, and everybody knew there would be a tidal wave because they knew they could read the signs of it. And so he took an icon and planted it on the beach and said, the tidal wave will not go beyond this point. And indeed, the tidal wave did not go beyond that point. He also fought a forest fire and all sorts of things. Saint Innocent came in 1824 and served initially in Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians. And in 1842 he became a bishop, the first bishop of North America. And he traveled all over his diocese. He went all the way down to California, all over the Bay Area, which at that time was before the gold rush. So it was basically just the Spanish missions, and it was Mexican territory or Spanish territory, and but eventually he got transferred back to Russia, where he became Bishop of Kamchatka in Siberia. And he traveled all over his diocese on dog sled, reindeer back, raft, boat, and sometimes just walking in eastern Siberia. Eventually, he went back to Moscow, and he succeeded his mentor, who was Metropolitan Filaret, who was one of the great figures of the Russian Church in the 19th century, who had encouraged St. Innocent to become a bishop and take up that mantle after his wife had died. And he had, and St. Innocent established the Russian Missionary Society, which is what funded the Russian Orthodox mission in North America. 1850, there was a parish established in San Francisco, and by 1872 they moved the diocesan headquarters from Sitka to San Francisco. And they were serving in English, preaching, teaching in English, and receiving converts.
I have a question. How come San Francisco really didn't become dominant in terms of Orthodoxy then?
It was for a while. Then in 1906 there was the massive earthquake.
Yeah.
And that it obliterated the cathedral, and it was too disrupted. Life was too disrupted there. So they transferred the see to New York. And part of the reason they did that is starting in the 1880s, there was a massive move of Greek Catholics from Slovakia and Austro-Hungary into the Orthodox Church. Uniates, Greek Catholics, who returned to the Russian Orthodox Church. And so that constituted about 300 parishes. So all of a sudden the mission more than doubled in the late 19th century and going into the 20th century. In 1896, St. Tikhon, as a young bishop, came to San Francisco, where he took the reins of the church in America, and he was very active all over the country, in Alaska as well as in the United States, on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and in between. And St. Tikhon established the vision of a united church in America with specific dioceses to oversee all of these various immigrations, all these various ethnic churches. So the first diocese that he established was for the Arabs, the Syrians, and that was he consecrated Bishop Raphael Hawawini, who was the first bishop consecrated in America, who pulled the Syrians together. He authorized Sebastian Dabovich, who is now a saint also. Raphael is a saint. Sebastian Dabovich, who organized the Serbian communities in America. And his plan was to have 6 or 7 overlapping dioceses, each dealing with their various ethnic group. And what's interesting is that at this point in the church's history, while the clergy were supplied largely by the Church of Russia, and a lot of the funding was from the Church of Russia, the people being served were Greeks, Serbs, Arabs, and kind of the general Orthodox mix. The Anglicans, the Episcopal Church in America, had been extremely open and hospitable to the Orthodox, and partly because they were still smarting from the Roman Catholic assessment that their orders were null and void, which came out around late 1890s. So they applied to the Orthodox because the High Church Episcopalians viewed themselves as Western Orthodox, essentially. And like the church I grew up in is in San Diego in La Jolla. All the doctrine was basically Orthodox, including the veneration of the Mother of God and the saints and the sacraments and the whole bit. So I'm still talking about before 1907. 1907, St. Tikhon gets transferred back to Russia.
Okay.
But by that time, several churches actually began to requested of the Orthodox Church. Several Episcopal, or the Anglican Church, began to request of the Orthodox churches to be recognized officially. Now, in 1905, under St. Tikhon, there was a study done in the Russian Orthodox Church, and they decided that they could not recognize them. However, over the next 20 years, the process continued in other churches, specifically with Constantinople and Romania, and they did recognize Anglican orders, which is interesting.
Well, back in 1907, what was the rationale for them not recognizing him?
I think that probably the same argument as the Romans, that it was interrupted with that whole Calvinist period, and essentially there's essentially a denial of that there was authentic continuity. But the Orthodox understanding is not just a continuity of, it's not just a historical game of tag, but it's rather a passing on of the whole tradition, and that the bishops are responsible for the fullness of the tradition. The whole church is responsible, but the bishops in particular are entrusted with it, and it has to be passed on in its fullness and integrity from generation to generation. And it's obvious that didn't happen in the Anglican Church, because for 200 years or more, 300 years, it was a Calvinist church. And so the doctrine was heretical, to say the least, and then their whole sacramental theology was flawed. But we don't. But on a technical level, we do not declare. The Orthodox Church officially recognizes the orders of the Roman Catholic Church. At least the Russian Orthodox Church does.
Well,
and so does
if a Roman Catholic priest wants to become Orthodox, is he reordained or just accepted? He's not reordained.
No, he's vested. This is the official doctrine, or the official position of the Russian Orthodox Church inside of Russia. Outside of Russia is a different story. But in Russia, in the Moscow Patriarchate, a Roman Catholic priest who wants to become Orthodox shows up at a liturgy, goes to the bishop receives him, like, "Hi, how are you doing? Welcome," invests him in Orthodox vestments, and he says the creed in the Orthodox manner, and that's it.
But he still has to be trained on how to conduct it.
He still has to be trained, yeah. So that's a controversial practice within the church. And for example, Rocor does not like that at all. And some of the more zealot parts of the church do not accept that. Though the Roman Catholic Church, or though the Ecumenical Patriarchate does accept that. That's their official. And some of the others I'm not so sure about. So that became a process. Now at this time, and we're talking about the right around 1917 to 1920. On one hand, you had, the ecumenical, the Church of Constantinople and the Church of Romania recognizing the Anglicans. The Russians declined, but things remained very warm between them. But the evangelical wing of the Anglicans pulled away, and because they didn't want all that Romish stuff. So that kind of ended that whole movement. Now in 1917, um, was the Russian Revolution. But there are actually two phases of that. The first one, 1917, then the Bolshevik coup was in October. With the abdication of the Tsar, the Romanov dynasty ended. And the church finally, although it had been planned, no authorization from the Tsar had been permitted. Although it had been planned for decades, the church finally was able to call a great council. And so there was this great council of the Russian church, which was unique because it not only included all the bishops, but it also included priests and lay people. And so there were many issues that were discussed. And on one hand, in certain of the seminaries, like in St. Petersburg, or theological academies, it was a very kind of progressive, for that era, in which one of the primary tasks was the restoration of the patriarchate. Peter I, so-called Peter the Great, had abolished the patriarchate and subjected the church to the state. And instead of a patriarch, he put a lay government official over the church, called an overprocurator. And the church still had its synod of bishops, but there was this lay government official who actually oversaw the church.
Why doesn't that taint the apostolic succession of the church?
Because its patriarchate is actually just administrative.
Because
It's just administrative, what you call it. And there was still a synod, an active synod of bishops.
Would I be jumping ahead of this here? But the question I have too is, why is Nicholas II declared a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church?
Because of the way he bore his martyrdom, the way he bore his suffering. He accepted to suffer. He accepted it as a Christian. He wasn't the Tsar anymore.
No.
Sacramentally, he was, because coronation is a sacrament of the church. But he had absolutely no political power at all.
Well, wouldn't
So he was murdered basically out of vengeance.
But on the other hand, too, one of the reasons he was in the situation he did because he really didn't conduct himself as a Christian patriarch, correct? Not a patriarch, but as a monarch, correct?
Well, yes, he did. He did conduct himself as a Christian monarch. He couldn't control everything, but monarchs have to make nasty, awful decisions sometimes. No, he was, he tried very hard to be a very upstanding Christian, Orthodox Christian Tsar. But you've got to also realize at the time, on one hand, Russia was this, very dynamic country that was modernizing and industrializing and all. I mean, the Bolshevik propaganda said, "Oh, it's just backward farmers, bunch of peasants." That was all propaganda. And the reality is that Russia was actually very advanced technologically. It didn't have, but it was also vast, and it did have a lot of peasants. But there was this great scientific and technological movement. But there were also, since the 1840s, there was a very bitter underclass that developed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and in the and it started particularly in the Jewish ghettos, but then it developed very acutely after 1867, or 1863, when Alexander II freed the serfs. And so you had thousands and thousands of people leaving the farm, leaving their families, leaving their property and everything to go to the city to get these industrial jobs. And there was this vast flood of labor, and it was more labor than the system could absorb all at one time. And so it created immense poverty and huge slums of people living in great suffering. St. John of Kronstadt talks a lot about this, and he ministered to a lot of these people. Or he tried as best as he could. But among those people who were living in such despair, in this ideology, the Marxist ideology of power to the workers and equality and all of this other stuff, and democracy and crept in. And so you had this huge urban population in all the major cities that was very not only restless but in great opposition to the traditional order in Russia. And so it was, and then you had terrorists as well. You had socialist terrorists who, and so political assassination was common, actually, in the 1880s and 90s. 1888, Alexander II was assassinated. And a lot of that was associated with this new political movement of socialists, communists, and so forth. And a lot of the leaders of that were Jews. Not all, but most. This kind of came to its ultimate fruition as Russia was struggling with World War I. And so the communists essentially took vast areas, or gained influence in vast areas of Russia, and established Soviets, which essentially means a committee. It's like a regional committee, a regional, I don't know what you'd call it, assembly or council.
Yeah.
And so this was and then there were riots. 1905 was a huge riot, and it was brutally suppressed. But what else do you do with a riot? So by 1917, the socialists had really taken the reins of power in much of Russia, and were able to force the abdication of the Tsar. So that allowed the Great Council of the Church, and people had great hope that democracy would be established in Russia. The socialists talk a lot about democracy, but it's only talk, and it's just empty words. It's the carrot to get people to follow.
Wasn't there an element that kind of wanted a constitutional monarchy like what they had in England?
That's exactly what they wanted, but the socialists didn't want any part of that. And part of it was because they were virulently anti-Christian, anti-Orthodox, anti-religious. And in saying that as Jews, it's important to understand that in talking about Russia, to be a Jew is not about religion. It's an ethnicity. In other words, it's a distinct subculture, and it was a very distinct subculture. And even through the Soviet period, people would have nationality written in their passport, and the Jews would have Jewish, not Russian, on their even in Soviet times.
Even though they're very much persecuted in the Soviets, right?
Well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
So 1917, you have the Great Council, the Patriarchate is restored. They pass a number of very kind of progressive reforms, but November rolls around, or October rolls around, the Patriarch is enthroned, and the Bolshevik coup happens, in which the provisional government was overthrown by Lenin and company, and a civil war ensues. But right at the beginning of the Civil War, the clergy began to be executed. And so actually a couple of the priests who were very prominent in establishing Orthodoxy in America, who built the cathedrals in Chicago and New York, were among the first martyrs of the Bolshevik Revolution. The revolution first, and then you had the Civil War until 1923. But during that time, it was chaos in Russia. Now, all the leaders of the church in America were in Moscow for that great council. So they were stuck, and some of them were being killed. So the church in America was essentially decapitated, at least momentarily. The Patriarch tried to manage things, but the Bolsheviks created an organization called the Living Church, which was radically renovationist. It embraced all of the reforms that not only were accepted by the 1917 Council, but all the reforms that were rejected by the 1917 Council. And the 1917 Council was much more radical than Vatican II, actually. So they wanted to tear down the iconostas, pull the altar out into the middle, get rid of monks and monasticism, have married bishops, new calendar, Russian language, all these things which were radical changes in the church's life. But especially parish councils, diocesan councils, and the inclusion of lay people on all levels of decision making within the church. And this was a radical reform, but part of that was also based on St. Tikhon's experience of watching the general councils of the Episcopal Church, which included clergy and laity, not just bishops.
How successful was all the? I mean, it wasn't very successful, was it, in terms of Orthodoxy?
Well, no. Everything was in chaos. You had this group, the Living Church, which the Soviet government supported and recognized officially as the official Russian Orthodox Church, and at the same time, you had the real hierarchy and the real Orthodox Church being bitterly persecuted. You know, the clergy were being shot, the believers were being shot, monasteries were being closed, properties were being confiscated. Priests, deacons, monks, nuns were all lined up against the wall and shot. It was just brutal.
How many died?
How many died?
Are estimated to die.
Well, in that, probably 20 million. And they have the actual records of the trials and executions of 200,000 priests. Okay? That's the ones that were executed, not the ones that were sent to Gulag and died in the Gulag.
So what were they trying, like what was the conviction?
A bitter hatred of God and of Christianity and of anything to do with it. And you know, at the foundation of communism is atheism. The state is God. And so anything that supplies identity or any sense of belonging or has to be that is not the state has to be eliminated. So religion has to be eliminated. The family has to be eliminated. Social organizations have to be eliminated. Along with eliminating the church, it can have no social outreach, charitable functions. It all has to be destroyed. And the Bolsheviks tried very hard to do that.
Well, Marx even said that the religion was the opiate of the people.
Yeah, well, and Lenin, and Lenin was as big a butcher as any of them, and just cold. So starting with about 1922 or 23, the patriarch was in and out of prison, and he was under house arrest for the next 2 years after that until he died in mysterious circumstances in 1925. Patriarch Tikhon, but in 1923. And we'll go back a bit. There was a council held in Constantinople, or a conference, more of a conference. And it was convened by the Patriarch of Constantinople, whose name was Meletios Metixakis. Metixakis was a Greek priest who had spent a lot of time in America trying to pull together the Greek communities. Most of the Greek communities in America were totally independent, and they even have written into their charters or their bylaws that no bishop has any authority over this congregation. So they would contract with a priest to come in and be their chaplain. and so some of them looked to the Church of Greece, some of them looked to Constantinople, but most of them just were Greek associations.
Did they essentially get away with that because they were highly immigrant culture without any type of oversight?
Well, yeah, and they didn't want to submit to the Russians.
What year did he become patriarch?
Tikhon, 1917.
No, Millet.
About 1922, I think. So, around 23, Meletios organizes this conference in Constantinople, which had a number of different things. It's what foisted the new calendar on the Orthodox Church, which created a schism of up to 40% of the church who broke from the canonical church. But that and other things, and Metixakis recognized the head of the living church as the real head of the Russian church and not Patriarch Tikhon. So, Metixakis refused to recognize the legitimate canonical church. Instead, they recognized the Soviet-sponsored.
What was the motivation for that?
God only knows. But this whole thing in Ukraine is just a replay of that.
Yeah.
It's just a replay.
So I have a quick question, if you don't mind, about the old calendar, new calendar. What was the rationale about creating a new calendar?
To bring it up to date, to harmonize it with the civil calendar.
If you throw out the Russian church, hasn't that really been the calendar of the Orthodox Church in general?
Except the Russian Orthodox Church has 2/3 of the Orthodox Christians in the world. So.
Because I read the only ones that really kept the old calendar were Russia, non-Athos. Let's see, those are the other two. There was three. Jerusalem
And Serbia.
Serbia, yeah, those are the only ones that actually kept the old calendar.
Right, but Russia is about 2/3 of the Orthodox world. The Serbian church is huge. Also, probably 25-30 million people. And Jerusalem is, of course, very significant. Mount Athos is very significant. And so,
We still got Greece and Bulgaria.
we've still got Greece and Bulgaria. Well, there's 14 churches. But they didn't, some of the churches actually divided. The Bulgarians had an old calendar, new calendar schism. I think the Romanians had an old calendar, new calendar schism. The Mediterranean churches went with the new calendar, except for Jerusalem. So the Syrians did, and the Alexandrians did.
How significant is the split in the Orthodox Church today with that?
Well, you've got churches using different calendars. There's no split there. They just use different calendars. But there are non-canonical groups that are called Old Calendarists.
I've read about that.
Yeah, and their objection is not just the calendar. Their objection is ecumenism, and which in many Orthodox circles, not just the Old Calendarist, is a dirty word.
So just any kind of dialogue with?
No, and wanting to ecumenism as the idea of compromising the faith for the sake of some kind of temporal unity, because it would be a compromise. What they're talking about. So all of the big ecumenist organizations, or ecumenical organizations, World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches, all this kind of stuff. Those have significance, but later on in the 20th century. Early on, they weren't even organized yet, and the whole ecumenist thing is really, the anti-ecumenist thing started in the 60s. 50s,
Wasn't
60s.
Orthodoxy all involved with the World Council of
Yeah,
Churches?
very involved. And I'll get to that.
Okay.
So Metexakis organizes this council, and they do the new calendar. They validate the remarriage of clergy after being widowed. According to the canons, clergy cannot remarry if they're widowed, and neither can the spouses of clergy remarry after they're widowed, unless there's a bishop gives a special.
But that's not worldwide, correct?
Well, that's one of the things that began in 1923 is that the Orthodox canonical church canonically kept the same rules. But after 1923, you had difference between, some of the churches kept these more liberal rules, and others kept the traditional rules. And so a split began to develop. And not a split necessarily, but a distinction.
So if a priest is widowed or divorced, all he has to do is look for a bishop that'll allow him to remarry. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, kind of, except that in most national churches that doesn't work. Now, it used to be in most national churches that didn't work. Now it's somewhat more lenient, and Constantinople recently just applied that decision of that council to its own practice for the remarriage of divorced clergy. Of course, that's in direct contradiction to the gospel. So that's a really important thing that you have. And it really what it does is it shows that this council was so arrogant that they could contradict the gospel. They would contradict the gospel itself. So that's a big problem, to say the least. So anyway, that contributed even more to the problems of the Russian Orthodox Church. So what happened is the Patriarchate remained under house arrest. The living church, it had its kind of fluorescence in the early 20s, and then it began to just die off because it was a movement of certain clergy, but not of the people. In 1925, Patriarch Tikhon dies under mysterious circumstances on the Feast of Annunciation, and his succession is unsure. So he has a whole number of locum tenens, bishops who assumed the position temporarily, and one of whom was Metropolitan Sergius Stragorodsky, who eventually remained in that position. And he wrote a letter trying to make peace with the Soviet government, saying that the church will accept the Soviet government as legitimate. Now, also going back to 1923, Patriarch Tikhon wrote an ukaz, which is a declaration that all the exterior dioceses and all of the Russian Orthodox outside of Russia should organize their own lives. And so you had major well-organized dioceses in North America and in Western Europe and in China. I don't think there was any place else. But so these bishops came together with the bishops that were able to flee Russia. And they were led by Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky. Anthony Krapovitsky had been one of the brightest lights in the Russian church and one of the most progressive theologians, and had been one of the candidates for patriarch. When they chose the patriarch, what they did was they put 3 names into a chalice, and a blind elder picked the name of the patriarch.
Literally blind.
Literally a blind elder. Somebody of absolute unimpeachable.
This was during the Soviet period.
Well, this was before the Soviet period.
Before Soviet.
Yeah,
Okay.
just 1917.
You say this guy's progressive. You mean that in the sense that he was a big defender of the traditional Orthodox faith, right?
Well, he was a defender of the traditional Orthodox faith, but he realized that the church needed to be structurally reformed, and its organization needed to be reformed. The patriarchate needed to be restored, and that there needed to be some lay participation in decision making. Those were the main issues in the Russian church coming out of the 19th century. And of course, relationship with the state needed to be defined. But Metropolitan Anthony and a number of other bishops, after a long journey, ended up in Serbia. They were the guests of the Serbian Patriarchate, and they formed the Synod of Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in Sremski Karlovci in Serbia. And that included the church in North America under Metropolitan Platon, and the church in Western Europe, which eventually would go under Metropolitan Evlogi. Basically, it took a while for the leaders to come back from Russia after the chaos of the Civil War and all of that. And the American church, Metropolitan Platon, was one of those who was very much involved in the formation of this, the Synod of Bishops of the church outside of Russia. And so the American diocese, the American archdiocese, essentially was a part of that. It was a diocese of that. They would go in and out of that synod of bishops. However, in America, there were certain groups that were much more oriented towards being with the group of the Synod of Bishops, and those who wanted independence. And in 1924, there was an All-American Council of the North American Archdiocese, at that time called the Russian Mission, which essentially declared temporary autonomy from the Church in Russia until such time as relationship could be restored. And
Is that ROCOR? Is that beginning of ROCOR?
Oh, this was the beginning of ROCOR. And based ROCOR, what is the Synod of the Bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. That is ROCOR. So ROCOR formed in Serbia, but included the Americans and West Europeans, as well as these exile bishops. Now, following World War I, there was a vast immigration to the United States. And following the Russian Civil War, there was another major immigration of Russians, the first major immigration of Russians to the United States, who were refugees from the Bolsheviks. And they entered into the Russian church that was here, which was part of the Synod abroad. This was the first time really that there was any significant number of Russians in the church in America aside from the clergy. But one of Meletios Metexakis' assertions was that Constantinople had universal jurisdiction outside of the established borders of the existing Orthodox churches. And therefore, it alone could have jurisdiction outside of the established borders. Now, so what they try to do is essentially declare the Russian mission in America and the Russian mission in Europe and elsewhere as uncanonical because it wasn't subject to them. And even though they had no hand in establishing it. So through 1927, there were no problems, of the church of the Synod abroad, as it's also called, being in communion with the church in Russia. And then Metropolitan Sergius issues his decree that the joys of the Soviet state are the joys of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the sorrows of the Soviet state are the sorrows of the Russian Orthodox Church, and what was read as a complete submission of the Russian Church to the Soviet government. Now, many of the bishops who had fled Russia were avid monarchists, and who were gathered in Karlovci, Sremski Karlovci. And so they issued a number of decrees which probably weren't very wise because they got people killed for anti-Soviet activity. And in America, you had this huge group of Carpatho-Russians, and then you had all these various non-Russian groups within the church, because it was multi-ethnic, right? So it had Arabs, it had Albanians, it had Serbs, it had some Greeks, it had all of these people that really didn't care about what was going on in Russia, and they just wanted to be Americans, and they liked democracy, and they also had no connection. There was no other connection than it's the same religion. And so a lot of the diocese in America, which was already second and third generation by this time, um, completely, rejected the whole monarchist trend of the bishops of the church abroad. So, but eventually the bishops of the church abroad broke communion with Patriarch Sergius, or with Metropolitan Sergius at that time. He didn't become patriarch until 1943 because of his alleged submission to the Soviet state. And so the church in America really was independent, except for its ties to the Synod of Bishops outside of Russia. And the Synod of Bishops outside of Russia also didn't want to have anything to do with the church that was under Soviet power. So so what happened in the 20s was, aside from the fact that the Russian part of the church, which meant most of the clergy, were preoccupied with dealing with all of these new immigrants and with dealing with the politics coming from overseas. There was also a so-called bishop from the Living Church that came over, and because the Soviet government officially recognized the Living Church as the legitimate church, remember the United States supported the Soviets against the Tsar. Millions of dollars worth. The properties of the Russian Orthodox Church, which were all vested in the name of the diocese, were handed over to the Living Church.
Was the Living Church bishop in apostolic succession?
No. Well, no, he's a heretic. He's a schismatic, and so that breaks any succession. A schismatic has no apostolic succession, and that's part of the problem with Rome, the schismatic. So you had chaos going on and illegal battles over church properties and all sorts of stuff going on. And so all these other ethnicities said, we don't want any part of this. And they went back to the old country and got bishops and priests to come over, and they created separate jurisdictions. Throughout the 20s, and the Antiochians were the last ones in the 30s to do that. There's always been a very close relationship between the Antiochian Church and the Russian Orthodox Church.
Why is that?
Probably because the Russian Orthodox Church forced the Greeks to let the Antiochians elect an Arab bishop. During the Turkish Millet, which was how everything was religiously organized under the Ottoman Empire, the Patriarch of Constantinople was put in charge of all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And so all the churches were suppressed, all the local hierarchies were suppressed, and all power was given to Constantinople. That was in the mid-19th century. All of those local churches, the churches in the Balkans and everywhere around the Mediterranean, regained their independence. They regained their autocephaly.
What was so dire or bad about having an Arab bishop?
Well, because
he was a Christian, huh?
the Greeks were in charge of it, and they didn't want to let go. And so to this day, for example, the entire leadership, with the exception of one bishop in Jerusalem, is dominated by Greeks. And you have to be an ethnic Greek and a Greek citizen in order to be in the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where they get all the bishops from for the Patriarchate of Jerusalem.
Well, I wasn't aware of that.
Oh yeah, it's very ethnic.
So someone that's a Palestinian, so to speak, and they cannot join the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre.
Nope.
Wow.
and it was the same in Antioch. And during the Turkish period, the patriarchs of Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and others mostly lived in Constantinople. They were, the church was, the Turkish period was a disaster for the Orthodox Church.
But the Antiochian church is primarily Arab, right?
It's all Arab, but they still had Greek leadership, which they'd had since the Crusades.
So the church of Antioch is actually run by Greeks?
It was.
Was.
And is no longer. Now, if you go to Damascus, which is where the headquarters are, you ask for the Antiochian church, and they'll look at you funny. And you'll say the Greek Orthodox Church, and they'll look at you funny. You have to say, I'm looking for the Roman Orthodox Church,
Oh.
and which is what it is in Arabic, Rum Orthodox.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's
So-
interesting because in my experience, it seems as if right now the Antiochian church and the Rokor are the most accommodating to converts
Yeah.
in America.
Yeah, and the OCA was as well, but many Episcopalians went into the Antiochians, many went into the OCA. Early on, very few went into Rokor. Later on, many have come into Rokor. So, but now we're 50 years ahead. So, it's a complex story. By 1930, most of the jurisdiction is accomplished. You've got Rokor on one hand for the Russians and Slavs, then you have the Serbs, the Albanians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and each with their own jurisdiction. In the early 30s, Moscow sent a bishop by the name, I believe, of Benjamin to America to try and bring back Moscow's flock in America. But that it also coincided with, to return to Moscow meant not only submission to the Soviet government, but it also meant that the clergy had to sign loyalty oaths to the Soviet government. And of course that didn't go over very well, to say the least. Then by 1937, you were dealing with the height of the persecution in the Russian Orthodox Church, of the church. Probably more clergy were executed around 1937, and more faithful. It was just a brutal time. Stalin was the purges were bitter. You'd asked about the Jews. When the Bolsheviks took over, most of the leadership was Jewish, and the Russian people looked at it as a Jewish takeover of their country, and they resented it bitterly. And this is where a lot of Russian anti-Semitism comes from.
So most of the Bolsheviks were Jewish?
Most of the Bolsheviks were Jewish. Trotsky,
Okay.
Lenin, all of
I don't know, Lenin.
except for Stalin.
That wasn't his real name anyway, was it? Lenin or something else?
No, actually, Lenin had been baptized as a Christian, but the thing is, they were all atheists. They weren't religious Jews; they were ethnic Jews, and so it's not the Jews that took over Russia. It's people who were of that ethnic background, who were deeply formed by Marxist-Leninist.
Well, most of them were ethnic Jews. How come they persecuted their own people then?
Well, what happened was, through the 30s, you had the first stage in the Russian Revolution. Hello.
Little father?
Anyway, so the first stage in the Bolshevik Revolution was essentially, the first 10 years was essentially a Jewish phase, with Jewish, largely the Jews, or Jewish leaders were in control. But it was also a time of absolute libertine lawlessness. And the Russians are, ethnic Russians, Christian or not, are inherently conservative people. And so they were really horrified. But this was the era of the radical liberation of women, you know, the elevation of women to be absolutely equivalent to men. But the ideology was the whole Soviet, or was the whole communist socialist ideology. Abolition of the family, abolition of religion, abolition of religious institutions, abolition of any kind of association other than the state. And so this kind of...
Sounds a little bit like what's going on here.
That's exactly what's going on here. This is just a rerun. And it's going to lead the same place if we're not careful. And so eventually the Russians, led by Stalin, which is interesting because he was a Georgian, rebelled against the leadership. And and Stalin did this massive purge of Jews from the Soviet hierarchy. Thousands of Jews were who were, you know, fairly in positions of power were murdered.
Well, correct me wrong, wasn't actually Trotsky Lenin's personal choice to succeed?
Yeah. But there was a difference in philosophy.
I'm going to realize that the Stalinists and the Trotskyites.
So,
and after that, though, you had people like Khrushchev and Andropov, and those,
right.
They weren't Jews, ethnic Jews at all,
No,
right?
no. And the success, and Stalin was Georgian, and he had even been a seminarian.
I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah.
And he blew up the cathedral, Saints.
Oh, he was
Savior.
He ultimately, you know, at least during a certain stage in his life, he hated the church. And Soviet atheism, socialist atheism, isn't the kind of namby-pamby, oh, I don't know, I don't think there's a God, but I don't really care kind of thing. It's not it. It's burning hatred that is violent. And that was the kind of atheism that possessed, and I use that word very specifically, that possessed the socialists. You have to be in I can't imagine a person doing that kind of just brutal violence unless they're just possessed by hatred. And so Soviet Union in the 30s, you had the Holodomor, the forced famine in the late 20s and 30s in Ukraine, and it was a bloodbath going on. Then it comes to World War II. And the Nazis are at the gates of Moscow. They laid siege to St. Petersburg. They were all the way to the Volga, which is way east of Moscow. Stalin realizes that he needs to rally the people and use the church to do it, and use religion to do it. So he frees the church. He allows the election of a patriarch, and he gives back churches. He opens up churches. He pulls people out of the gulag. He pulls bishops out of the gulag to elect the patriarch. He pulls priests out of the gulag to reopen the churches, and there's a kind of a brief reflowering of Christianity in Russia from 1943 until his death in 1953. And some people think that he repented. I don't know.
Well, if he hadn't done all that, that probably would have been toast, right? The Nazis probably would have.
Oh, the Nazis would have taken, yeah, they would have taken Russia. Because really it was Russia by far was the main adversary. Most of the West had fallen. And you had the British and the Americans, but the Americans didn't get into Europe until 1944. into the European theater. So it was a big, it was a.
Some people blamed it on the weather with the Soviet, when it was the Nazis.
Well, that's always part of it, but others attribute it to the Mother of God, because Stalin had the Vladimir icon of the Mother of God flown around the city of Moscow, and he had the Kazan icon of the Mother of God flown around the city of St. Petersburg as the cities were under siege, and the siege was broken. So
if he hadn't done that, then Hitler would have overtaken him.
Yeah. So despite the incredible bloodbath that he's responsible for, another 20 million people probably between the wars and stuff.
I do remember when I was a child, I saw this, I guess, a documentary on what preceded World War II, and they said that Lindbergh had actually gone over to Russia. He said the United States should stay out of it. He said because their aviation was just so superior to anything that was in the rest of the world.
Russia's aviation?
Yeah.
Probably was.
Okay.
So 1946, with this new freedom of the Russian Orthodox Church, you had all these jurisdictions in America kind of doing their own thing. And then the anti-monarchist faction of the Russian Church in America decides that given this new freedom that the church has under Stalin, that it's time to reconcile with Moscow. They've got the new they've got the patriarch. Sergius had only lasted very briefly, a year or two, I think, and then he was succeeded by Alexei I.
Well, he passed away.
He died, yeah. He was elderly by that time. And my God, having lived how many years in prison or in house arrest. So a whole segment of the Russian Orthodox, of the Synod of Rochor in America, broke with the other segment of the Synod in America, which was more heavily Russian immigrants, and this group became known as the Metropolia. In other words, the Metropolitan See, and they approached Moscow, but Moscow still demanded a loyalty oath. But in the meantime, they had burned bridges with Rochor. So this group, the Metropolia, found itself isolated, both from Rochor as well as from the Russian Orthodox Church, and it was regarded by both as schismatic, which is a very important technical term and a technical state in which apostolic succession is viewed as being cut. And this group, which actually was a very large proportion of the church, Russian church in America, was basically kind of left adrift canonically. It began discussions in 1960 thanks to the World Council of Churches. Because starting in the late 40s, when the World Council of Churches was formed, and the Russian church was participating in the World Council as well as all the rest of the churches, the World Council of Churches provided a context for the Russian church hierarchs to come and to let people in the West know about the persecution that was happening. Because there had been almost Russia was a closed society to a great extent.
So without that, the Russian church might not have gotten involved in the Council of Churches.
Right. And so, for example, head of the Department of External Affairs at that time was Metropolitan Nicodim of Leningrad, and he would go to these meetings in the West. Eventually, they were mainly held in New York, and there would be all of these leaders of the churches, And while on one hand he had to publicly say, oh, everything is fine, you know, there's no persecution, Soviet government's being great to us, privately he would tell the trusted, those whom he trusted, the real story. And so, of course, he couldn't do it publicly because he would never be able to get out again to go, you know, to do that. So, so this created a context of for meeting, and the leaders of well, in the mid-50s, there were two theologians from Paris, and the Russian immigration, both from the first immigration after the Russian Civil War and the second immigration after World War II, a part of that immigration had settled in Paris. Paris was really mostly first immigration, with a lot from the Second World War, and then there was the Russians spread out all over the world. But these two theologians were Alexander Schmemann and John Meyendorff, and they had been involved in the Saint-Serge Theological Institute in Paris, which was under Metropolitan of Logi, who was the head of the Russian diocese in Western Europe, and he also had decided to split from the church abroad, or from Rocourt. But instead of, and he had also looked at going under Moscow, but Moscow required these loyalty oaths and things like that. So he ended up going under Constantinople. And that diocese only dissolved last year. We'll see what it does. It's probably going back.
Which diocese was this now?
This diocese of the Russian Orthodox Church in Western Europe.
Okay, I'm
Under Constantinople.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, okay.
They're probably going to go under Moscow now.
But they dissolved, wow.
It was dissolved by Bartholomew, and for various reasons. So the situation in Western Europe, well, they had this theological institute, which was very progressive and very kind of renovationist in mostly positive ways, for the most part. But Schmemann and Meyendorff thought that the church in Western Europe was not going to go anywhere. And so they moved over, and they saw that this group in America, the Metropolia, was leaderless. It had bishops, but the bishops were not really leaders. So
they
they
were
went
doing
in.
the divine liturgy, and that was it.
Yeah, essentially. So they went in, and they essentially took over St. Vladimir's Seminary and made St. Vladimir's Seminary kind of the head of the leadership, into the leadership of the church.
So Father Schmemann, even though he was Russian, he was under the Greek...
Well, he was Russian who grew up in Paris, and Meyendorff also grew up in Paris. So they were ethnically Russian, but ended up in Paris. And so, and one of the things about that, while this group, the Metropolia, had no canonical standing in the Orthodox world, it gained it gained some kind of recognition because of its relationship to the World Council of Churches. And because of the connection between the Russian Orthodox Church and the World Council of Churches and the Metropolia and the World Council of Churches, they were able to meet with Metropolitan Nicodemus. And so they began in 1960 a whole series of negotiations to try and bring the Metropolia, which was classed as dually schismatic, both from the Russian Church and from Rocourt, as into the fold of the Russian Church. So, that resulted in 1970 that the Metropolia was given autocephaly by the Russian Orthodox Church, which means full independence. Rokor rejected that move saw it as a capitulation to the communists, basically. That the new so-called OCA had become part of the communist church. And Rokor basically didn't reconcile until 2007 with the Russian Orthodox, with the church in Russia.
Well, part of that, was that what had actually going on in the Russian church? Was that why they're feeling that some of the priests that were in the Russian church were actually KGB?
Yeah. And undoubtedly they were. They had to cooperate with the KGB, just like our hierarchy cooperates with our law enforcement.
Okay.
So when we bring it home, it makes it a little more. So we've got so by 1980, okay, you've got the OCA, which is the former Metropolia. You've got Rokor, and then you have a small group called parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate. These are parishes that over the course of from the 30s through the 60s did submit to Moscow, and it was only a handful of them. At some point they dropped the necessity of a loyalty oath to the Soviet government, and so they were just Russian Orthodox churches.
Well, there's no more Soviet government.
Well, no, between the 30s and the 70s.
Okay, gotcha.
And so, or 60s actually. And so, but you had these churches, they weren't part of the Metropolia, and they weren't part of Rokor, but they were directly under Moscow. And they had Moscow only, and they still exist. Moscow had bishops in America with American titles, like Bishop of San Francisco, Bishop of New York, until 1970, when it gave the OCA autocephaly.
What were they called then?
Before?
No, what were they called after they were called like Bishop of San Francisco and...
Oh, they had the name of some city in Russia.
Oh, I see, okay.
So, hello.
But
So, but one of the things that's interesting, although Moscow never regarded Rokor as schismatic per se. Separated, yes, but not as schismatic.
because they maintained the theology.
Right.
It was the political.
Yeah, Rokor tended to use the term schismatic a little more.
Did monks have to take the loyalty of the Soviet government?
Who?
Monks and nuns.
I don't think so. That was only clergy,
Well, there were clergy that were...
and specifically bishops. So,
so abbots didn't then. Well, of course they
I don't know.
dissolved
I wouldn't think so.
They dissolved the monasteries anyway, right?
Oh yeah. Oh, in Russia, yeah. Lenin closed most of the churches. Stalin reopened 25 or 30,000 churches, and then Khrushchev closed all but 5,000 churches, and all the monasteries except for 4 men's monasteries and 10 women's monasteries.
Yet they threw him out in 1974. 1964, they threw him out, right?
Khrushchev?
Yeah.
I don't remember that part of it. I haven't focused on Soviet history that much.
Oh, okay.
non-political history.
Who was head of the OCA in 2007?
In 2007, it was Metropolitan Herman. Before him was Metropolitan Theodosius from 1979. And before him was Metropolitan Irritable. And before him was Turkevich. I can't remember.
Are there any vestiges of the living church in existence?
No, it's gone. It was gone by the 30s, pretty much.
Is it because the people just essentially rejected it?
The people rejected it. It was a state-sponsored thing.
Yeah,
So,
it seems to be a theme in Orthodox history.
yeah. You know, the people. You know, it's very important to understand that the body of the church ultimately bears the full responsibility for the integrity of the church, not just the clergy. You know, the bishops personify that, but you know, there are instances in history where you have the people standing up and rejecting the decisions of the hierarchy. Mark of Ephesus led the resistance against the Council of Florence, and so Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century. And then, like this, the living church. And there's plenty of other examples too. So, it's, you know, Orthodoxy is hierarchical, but it's also very holistic. And it's the idea of mutual responsibility for the integrity of the church is very important.
So, what was the date? It might even be before the timeline that you set out, but kind of it's not a rift by any means, but a different point of view between the ecumenical patriarch or Constantinople and then the Russian church, essentially.
Well, Meletius Medixakis, I don't know of any major issues before 1923.
Oh, interesting.
Meletius between the two. Meletius created all sorts of problems, both in his ideology as well as his actions, recognizing the living church. But then he also, for example, he seized the Finnish church from the Russian church. Finland had been a province of Russia, and Lenin gave it its independence as a country. But it was, there's a huge Orthodox population in Finland, and Constantinople went in and essentially took it.
But aren't they completely on the Western calendar in Finland?
In Finland they are, yeah. And that's partly because of the government there. They insist that the Orthodox Church use the Western Paschalian, as well as the new calendar. And so then you've got, you have, Russia had given autocephaly to the Church of Poland, Church of Czechoslovakia, and I don't remember, and the OCA. Poland and Czechoslovakia were both threatened by the ecumenical patriarchate, essentially, and which gave them autocephaly from itself because they refused to recognize that Moscow had the authority. And then, and then the OCA, Constantinople, has not recognized at all since its creation. And then they recognize them as canonical bishops, but they don't recognize it as a church. And Then in 96, Constantinople invaded the territory of the Moscow Patriarchate in Estonia. And this was particularly bitter because the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Alexei II, was from Estonia and had been the Metropolitan of Riga. And so Constantinople went in and it split the church in Estonia between Russian Orthodox and Estonian Orthodox. Anyway, we should go over next door and get ready for Vespers.
Thank you.
Thank you.